that discussion that we had around delivery. So I described a matrix of homes and commercial buildings and existing and new build. And I think the one that we didn't discuss too much was existing public and commercial buildings. So particularly those of you who have got direct experience and responsibility of trying to get big organisations to do big things with their existing buildings, how do we do this at scale? How do we do it quickly?
Give us lots of money. it's straightforward. Seriously though, with the hospital, we're spending over £7 million on retrofitting energy efficiency solutions to a degree. Some of it's on-site generation as well, and that will reduce our carbon emissions by around 17% from building energy. Part of it is a gas CHP, so that figure will kind of change and go backwards as the grid carbon intensity changes. We selected a relatively long payback, I would say, a kind of a mid-term one, but for the longer term measures, it's really quite challenging to make it stack up financially. So case in point, we're looking at refurbishing an office block, and to refurb it's say, I think 1980s type build, and to get that to meet what we think the new Part L regulations will be, it pretty much doubles the cost of the refurbishment to a point where you kind of think that's not going to pay back in a particularly short time. There would be efficiency savings, and then to achieve a 25% betterment to that, it's not actually that very much difference at all. It's like maybe 1% or 2% extra to get a 25% betterment. So, but it's getting it to that initial substantial increase, a meaningful increase, and then to get to net zero on top of that, it wouldn't be, again, not loads more, but it's, you know, how do you sell something that costs twice as much as what a business as usual one is?
So the payback terms that you mentioned there, what are they exactly? What's a short, medium and long-term payback in your world?
So we were looking at about 7-8 years payback, and that was kind of medium. That was kind of pushing it, to be honest. And then, so anything above that, we have other projects to look at, which are 8 years or above.
So it strikes me that that's very short. You know, if you're building a building afresh, you'd finance it over 30 years, wouldn't you, or even 60?
Well, yeah, but these are retrofit improvements, and so a 30-year payback on a retrofit isn't particularly appealing. Or when you're looking at revenue costs, I don't know, but I don't think that the trust plans 30 years ahead in terms of its revenue budget.
Perhaps it should.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just a moment. So, James, I think you raised on your agenda of issues somewhere about this question about whether we should be doing incremental approaches or whether we should be doing step change. And if our target is net zero, maybe it's a really, really bad idea to do the quick, easy things first and then think about the slightly longer term, more difficult things some point down the future, and then think about the final 20% last. Isn't that going to be the most expensive way to do it? If our target is really net zero and your organisation has declared climate emergency, then shouldn't we be starting with the end in mind, starting with net zero as the target, and then working out the most cost-effective way of doing it?
Yeah, I agree completely, but there is an affordability issue, and if you haven't got budget certainty beyond 1 or 2 years, how do you program in a 30-year strategy?
So the German government has this KfW bank, I think it's called, which is low-cost finance for all sorts of regional and local development, and this sort of work does fall into that. And we don't have anything like that, so maybe you need something like that as a cost of external source of finance.
So Salix are offering a decarbonisation fund, which I've been having some conversations with them about, and I think it might fall into that bracket. So it's only initial conversations, and I don't quite understand it yet, to be honest.
Okay. Thank Dan. Yeah.
Yeah, just to pick up on this sector, I think maybe a reason we didn't naturally pick up on it before the break was that it tends to be a forgotten sector. It's often forgotten in terms of national policy. When you look at the Committee on Climate Change, they talk about the non-domestic sector becoming 25% more efficient, but they don't really say how, and there's no detail and no policy to back it up. So I think historically there have been things like league tables, to go back to the point about voluntary codes, and I think in my view, in terms of how they've panned out, they don't really work. They tend to be seen as a bit of a box-ticky compliance issue without necessarily resulting in any benefits. I think one potential good thing about this sector is that non-domestic buildings are a bit more dependent on electricity compared to direct emissions as opposed to homes. So it will be to some extent helped out by the decarbonisation of the power sector, which isn't to say that we shouldn't be reducing energy consumption, because that will be important, but that will help in this specific sector. There's also definitely a kind of distinction between the private and the public sector. So I think when we spoke about social housing and private housing, there's a similar sort of thing where public sector in theory can lead by example, and across universities or across the NHS estate, there will be internal carbon reduction targets, which should help to drive that. But I think one area where we could be doing things a lot better is in terms of joining organisations up so that they're talking to each other and learning from what worked well in terms of technologies, because they're quite diverse compared to dwellings where you've got your fabric and then lights and then the things that people bring into their homes. Non-domestic buildings are very diverse with lots of processes, lots of technologies, and there's a lot of good learning that could be going on between the public and the private sector and between organisations. And as well as knowledge exchange, they could be joining up together to procure energy improvements via energy performance contracting or other measures, and I think that's happening not anywhere near as much as it could in the context of a climate emergency. I know, for example, Plymouth used to have something called the NI 186 group, which brought together significant non-domestic businesses and public sector within the city. I think that probably went at the beginning of austerity, but I think maybe it's time to start bringing these sorts of initiatives back so that this particular sector isn't left behind.
Thank you very much, Stan. Alistair's the empty chair now, but it was a great opportunity for him to come in and say a bit more about his Southwest Energy Partnership, which I think is Devon County Council, Plymouth City Council and Bristol City Council working together to look at how they could invest their monies best in a lot of energy projects, but particularly in their own estate. Kareem.
First thing is, commercial properties, the capital investment usually by the landlord, the tenant often gets the benefit when they've carried out the works, and so the lease needs to reflect that relationship, and that's not common. But the issue of the challenge, for me, you're right, 2030 we need to work back. So 2030 is the target. So every time we give funding to the development world to de-risk their sites by providing roads and bridges and everything else they need from us, we should mandate as a result of that, as a condition of the funding that opens up your land, that you hit the standards that we're going to be specifying. And we did it with previous regimes like the RDA, when Cranbrook was required to sign up to district heating as a consequence of the investment that was made into that. And I think there's nothing wrong with the region leading by example and saying, if we're investing, you need to stand up to these carbon objectives. That's the kind of first thing. Second is, by example, between now and 2000, if you're going to go through the planning process, I'm telling you now, 10 years from concept, planning, building, it's going to be 10 years. So if we're not mandating now that ambition, we've got a problem, which means I'm going to ask, as a chief executive of an organisation, I'm going to put on the table what we need. When we were building our leisure pool with Passive House, we didn't get much credit in the media, in the public, for the cost associated with hitting that environmental performance. It didn't. We had to take it on the chin. by showing leadership. There's an issue for us across Devon. If we're going to hit this 2030 target, if the public sector leads by example, and we used to do this, we used to build civic buildings that had pride. Whenever you went to a place, you knew what was civic, because the big courthouse, the big civic centre, we put the pride in them, we got the architecture right, we led by example. When we build public buildings in Devon, it's unthinkable over the next 10 years that we should be signing up to less than the passive, sorry, I'm using passive, I mean zero carbon, whatever the standard. And we need a media that understands that cost, and it's a whole life cost, and they need to be on our side. We shouldn't be able to fight in order to put, you know what the mantra is, cheap, as opposed to you're investing for the long term. So in Devon, I think we need to hold courage if we're going to make this happen.
Thank you very much, Kareem. Powerful.
Just one observation, and it stuck in my mind when you said it, Andy. We need to hold our nerve was the words you used. Now, those interventions that Kareem's talked about, if there's 100% control of the product, then fine. But where we've got some intermediate situations, Sherford being a good example, Cranbrook being a good example, but just understand what that means. We need to hold our nerves. Is this something that we should be addressing? How do we tackle these challenges?
So by that I meant that we had a vision, if you like, in 2007. It's been challenging because of change in the interim, and government policy hasn't necessarily supported that journey. A commercial partner is a bit flaky at the moment, but, you know, in the context of a climate emergency, we have to follow through and achieve that ultimate objective from my perspective, and that's very clear. And there's a greater incentive for doing that now, from my perspective. And that's not just residential, that's across the whole corridor, from my perspective. And, you know, politically, as Kareem said, the leadership point is really key within that, and really putting that stamp on it, because when it comes to pushback from the likes of house builders, for example, I'm not saying all of them, but you have to hold the line.
Thanks, Andy. Before we, so we're just going to a few last comments on this issue, and then we'll close it down and we'll move on to James, who's going to talk us through strategy. So, Alan, Luke, do you want to come back and say something? Does anybody else want to say something on this topic before we move on? Okay, just over to you, Alan.
I think picking up on what you said, you know, things are getting worse. They're going to continue to do so. You know, really saying, well, what does it mean, climate emergency? What are we going to do? Back to carrot and stick, I think what you're also saying is that there are business models that work. And, you know, and again, picking up on some of what Kareem's saying, you know, future-proofing the economy of the region, giving businesses a nudge, and to say, if you want to future-proof your business, unless you're operating in this way, you're not going to have a business. So, you know, I think a bit of regulation is, of course, stick, but it might also just be, you know, a nudge to say, you know, unless you are getting with this program, your business isn't going to be viable. It's not going to be able to operate in the conditions that are coming very rapidly down the road, where some of this will not be an optional extra. So, of course, you know, the city can lead and various authorities can lead. But I think as well, you know, just kind of saying in other ways, unless your business can now adapt, then it's not going to be the business that's going to flourish in this region.
I'd back that, Andy. I do think, yeah, carrots, we need that, and stick, we need that, but I do believe transformation comes from new business models. That's the quickest way to transform something, is create a business model to work. There was, let's be trying to find my mobile phone. If I had my mobile phone to hand, I'd wave it and said there was no carrot around getting me to get that, and there was no stick saying I had to get one, but we've all got one. And it happened really quickly. So technology and a business model together can really transform things really quickly. Luke, sorry.
Yeah, so two things. One about renewable energy, and one about just going back to the kind of energy performance contract and large procurements of those type of things. So several years ago, myself, Alistair, Joe from Exeter City Council, and Ian, we looked at what kind of things we could do to fulfil that thing, if it makes sense, public sector organisations, and Andy Seaman from the university as well. We all came together and also, sorry, I've stopped going to names. We basically tried it, and we were all quite in different places, organisations, strategically, and it was just really difficult to time consuming, and in the end, from the RD&E's perspective, it was like, well, we're here, we need to do something now, so we can't really afford to slow down to try and do something with everyone else, even if as a longer term goal that it might have worked better, I don't know, but there are also other frameworks that are available for more discrete projects, so sometimes maybe looking at a massive holistic project isn't always the best way to do. Sometimes it's just, we need to put some new lights in, go and get a lighting contractor to do that. And when you think about building up the local supply chains, I think that's possibly, it could be more opportunity there. So is there a small to medium-sized business that will provide LED lighting, say, but they're not likely to get the contract if they end up going in with a large-scale contractor who's a subcontractor type operator on a national scale. So I think there's a bit of consideration with that about how to do that. And it, the energy performance contract that we're doing, I think it was the best option for us at the time. If we had more resources or different, we're in a different situation, we might have done a different thing, but that's the best one for us at the time. But the other bit is about switching energy providers, like you mentioned earlier, about just changing to a renewable electricity contract, and that's something that over the next 12 months or so I'm going to be looking at when it's time for our contract renewals. At the moment we run through Crown Commercial Services, as does lots of public sector organisations through the country, and there's an option of having renewable energy, and that is through the re-go back to electricity, so you're not necessarily funding any new generation, you just pay a bit of a premium and you get a proportion of the renewable energy that's already being generated, and it's not really doing anything other than kind of saying, yeah, we're trying to do something, this is we're putting our hat in the ring. And the next thing is I'm looking at a power purchase agreement. So how do we fund local renewable generation? And there's organisations that can help with that, either through frameworks or to set it up a standalone one. And there's potential, for example, say a wind farm. We could have a Devon wind farm that the public sector bodies all say we're going to commit to whatever a 7-year agreement to buy electricity. For that, that's just a pretty broad brush idea, but that's kind of the art of the possible. So yeah, that's my take on that bit.
Thanks very much, Luke. So I think one last comment.
Sorry, I was just going to add some kind of knowledge sharing really, and as I said earlier, I'm working a lot with Cornwall Council, who declared the climate emergency. I think they were one of the first councils to do it, but they've also set the bar by saying by 2030 all of their buildings that they own and manage will be zero carbon, and I don't think Devon's got to that space yet, or the local authorities in Devon, but they've also set out in their carbon, I think it's climate change action plan, their spheres of influence, and they know that in terms of the number of buildings in Cornwall, fine, they only own or manage a small number, but if they lead the industry by saying, okay, we're going to be zero carbon in 10 years, and if through policy they go up to the next sphere of influence and start to enforce people to be zero carbon, and then they go through what they can influence locally, and then finally it's what they can ask for help with nationally. So they're setting out a plan for, as a minimum, what they're going to do with their assets, and I'd suggest Devon needs to look at doing the same, and every local authority in Devon.
Thank you. Good suggestion. Shall we move on then? Shall we hand over to James, who's going to lead us through a discussion on the strategic planning issues and land use issues?
I don't think anybody intended these things to be moved around physically, did they? However, yeah, we've already touched on planning matters. Also, there's a session on the 11th of December where we'll be looking at spatial strategy again as part of this sort of drawing together the strands of the individual thematic hearings. So this is not the only opportunity, but I'll offer you two levels of looking at the planning system. The first is in terms of planning instruments and regulations. So we've already talked about some of that, the ability to seek higher environmental performance in buildings. I chuck in a few others, such as the insistence on green infrastructure, development mix, and things like live work. So there's things that planning can specifically do that might make a difference. But of course the other side of the planning system, which Charles and Kareem have touched on as well, is its strategic role. It's kind of role of seeing the big picture and how things fit together, and basically its role in systems thinking, which is where the planning system came from, and its antecedents. Ebenezer Howard in particular was not planning just for built development. He was planning for what we now call green infrastructure, but for green land for public use. But he was also planning for agriculture and forestry in the same path. And for me, that seems quite relevant when we move to the climate emergency, because there are win-wins to be had, but there are fundamental connections within the system that we cannot ignore, because the planning system also plans for rural areas in a particular way at the moment, with some very fixed assumptions about what that means. So this is an opportunity to talk about the different roles of the planning system, and indeed, I would hope, how we might embolden some of those roles in trying to set down land use patterns that are more conducive to try and meet net zero by 2030, and then go beyond that in terms of planning decisions. But I was also quite taken with something Andrew said about quick policy, because having written 3 neighbourhood plans now, they take an inordinately long time to produce. We just don't have time for a local plan cycle of 8 to 10 years to do something here. So partly that's an ask of national government about, can we change the way the system works, but also what can we do in terms of quick policy with this expedient, I think, is another thing I'd add to this slot for discussion. So contributions, please.
Sorry, there's a bit of a voluntary contribution type thing, that the anchor organisations can publish their plans and lead by example, and even if it's not a mandatory thing, at least there is that established, well, this is what we're doing. We are big organisations, we are responsible and accountable organisations, and if we can push the standards out that way, then you don't have to wait to do anything.
And I guess that also has echoes in what you're doing in Exeter, which is you're saying, I know what the system is, but we're going to push further anyhow and hope you catch up almost.
I would use place shaping as the description rather than traditional planning. Although I think the ingredients of good placemaking has at the heart an understanding of that kind of basic planning model. But what you were illustrating was the system, thinking whole system approach. So when Dan and Hall are doing some really interesting things in terms of the rural economy and food production, that is connected to the urban areas, no different. I mean, part of the mistake is we kind of separate out urban and rural, but we're entirely dependent on each other. And some of the research that is being done around Exeter with the Impact Lab and what's going on with Rothamsted and others, understanding how you live better, which is why our brand has shifted to livable Exeter, because the emphasis now is on people, not on chimney pots, because the focus on housing numbers drives a certain behaviour. When you start focusing on people and how people experience their settlement and their relationships with the land that produces the food that they're going to eat and consume, you suddenly have a different conversation. So my contribution would be, we went from, some bit of pushback, healthy pushback from our neighbours in terms of house building, that said the city needs to do a bit more to build within the city at higher down. And we said, fine. We went from there to publishing a document put into the public domain within weeks. And our politician have fronted that up on the basis that it's genuinely about place shaping. And there is a serious element of that, which is we own an awful lot of assets. And if we don't own the asset, we have a lot of key sites that make those assets come forward. And something about the development industry, and Tim will know this, what you want is confidence, because you want to know where to invest your money. And so if the local planning authority, even in a document which is non-planning document, can give a sense of the direction of travel over the next 20 years, where we are going to be making investment in infrastructure. And I'll give you an example. We've said very categorically, we want to deliver car-free developments in the city. And we've got sites that will be unlocked if you go down that route. And if you want to go down the planning route, fine. But you might find it takes an awful lot of time to get out of the ground. So I would say it's not an excuse. It's genuine. Planning is genuine. Neighbourhood plans are complete bureaucracy and over complex compared to what you want, which are often in rural communities. Residents want to build houses, often in their neighbourhoods, and some planners tell them it's not sustainable. There you are. That's the system you've inherited. So we've got to find a way of making it happen, and that place shaping agenda, I think, helps. And if you start to focus on the outcomes we're trying to achieve, so carbon is one of the outcomes, but it comes about because you can genuinely walk and cycle to the facilities that you need and get a loaf of bread from the corner shop. And today, and Tim again, he knows this, the commercial world don't build corner shops anymore. And yet every master plan that goes in has a lovely corner shop. And we present it to our residents, what we're going to deliver is a lovely little neighbour. No, we won't. We won't deliver it unless we find a different way. And the one thing I can say to you, you see Poundbury and see what the Prince has done 30 years ago and how you build quality because of the control and commitment to the, to outcomes, quality. And that's part of what we're going to do. So that's a really long-winded way to say, let's not use a planning system as an excuse. Let's get our vision out there, focus on people, not on buildings, but importantly, and I'm glad you're here from Darlington, which is this isn't about rural and urban. Sustainable development can happen everywhere.
Just wanted to kind of echo that really, again. But for me, it was really impressive what happened with the Liverpool X to Work. It went from probably over the course of about 3 months, from nothing into a public document that was in the domain. It really captured people's imagination. And that kind of turned things around in terms of what was going to happen within the city and drove a lot of confidence, I think. Tim, probably best placed to comment on that. But for me, there was a really fundamental point there. If you look at Greater Exeter, you've got a local industrial strategy that majors on clean growth. You've got a housing strategy that's going to deliver 60+% of new housing through garden city or garden community principles. You've got a transport strategy that says 50% of trips by walking and cycling. Well, everything's lined up from my perspective. I think the point Karim's making is, I'm reminded of an Eisenhower quote that, plans are hopeless, but planning is essential. And we're not going to get proper, formally, progressed plans. It took East Devon, I think, 8 years to do the last local plan review. If we do that, standard operating procedure is not going to work. We have to have something that's much more agile, like the city have done.
Andrew.
Yeah, I share a lot of the issues being raised there. I just think I think I've had the debate with a number of people today saying, at the moment, I'm sensing in terms of planning, and this isn't necessarily peculiar. It is about housing numbers. I mean, that the need for more housing is common, but it's the way we're being judged as planning authorities is about how many you're delivering. It isn't about the quality. It isn't about the sustainability of the homes. So we have the housing delivery test, we have to submit a housing action plan, all geared towards how we're going to achieve the numbers rather than the quality side of things. So just wanted to sort of echo that really, to say I think that's a fundamental issue for us.
Luke.
Yes, it is Luke. I was thinking about as well something that Karim had said about the kind of the PR side of it and the branding, and does the Newsroom Leisure Centre get enough credit for its sustainability credentials? And I'm really aware that around the hospital trust in the last year or two, people's views on this have become a lot more forthright, and a lot of people, instead of saying, "Oh, why are you wasting money on that?" are saying, "Why aren't we doing this? Why isn't this an efficient thing? Why is our solar panels?" And a lot of people they want it, and that perhaps one of the keys is promoting this agenda and saying, well, this is what people want, and it's also what they need, and this is what we're going to do, and try and just engage with people a lot more. And I know there's a lot of information on what we need to do in terms of technical information, and there's a lot of solutions out there, and it's perhaps maybe somehow harbouring that groundswell of public movement into approving things quicker through attending council meetings, driving stuff, and trying to take a bit more of their own responsibility in it and using their energy to push things through.
Andrew.
Just on the I suppose, the community engagement side, because I think that's fundamental. I do appreciate what Kareem's saying about planning can take a long time, and part of that is engaging with the community, trying to listen to everyone, weighing up their views. And I think we've got to be a bit careful on that one, because obviously the climate change emergency is hugely critical. But classic is, whenever you go to planning committee, you hear all the people telling you why the development is wrong. You will not get people turning up and saying, this is fantastic, we've got a district heating plant here. You'll get, this is a greenfield you shouldn't be building. So again, that community engagement is absolutely critical. So I think we must make sure that we have the community support if we are going to move quickly as well. So I think rather than rushing into finding the answer, there is a stage still to go through to get the community to actually support our actions, really. Otherwise, if they're not supporting it, we're not going to get true buy-in to what we're going to be delivering.
Alan, did you want to come in? And Erica, thank you.
Well, I just wanted to, again, echo what Kareem was saying. I mean, a lot of what I'm trying to do is think about place shaping, ecological place shaping, and not to separate out, housing from other concerns about food futures, mobility futures, etc. I mean, and just to say what we've been doing is trying to reach out and form relationships with projects in other regions that are trying to think about integrated solutions to these challenges. I mean, interested to hear what our REMA colleague would say. I mean, I was part of a thing called the Academy of Urbanism a little while ago, and they came up with some great solutions in terms of great principles for placemaking, which, and some of them were about, sustained footfall in areas which, reduced crime, sustained and varied footfall, which meant that you didn't design a commercial district, a business district, housing zones, because you're creating these various kinds of gated communities, which increase crime and increase the amount of the distance between work and home, and it discouraged community coherence and cohesion. We actually know some great things about how you develop integrated solutions to places, not just buildings. And unless we think in that way, where we might develop some not carbon zero homes, but miles away from work, and we haven't thought about the the mobility's futures there. And again, food, not separating out the urban and the rural, where we get our food from, whether we're buying it in a corner shop or not, what are the food miles of that, and how do we think about the whole region, not just one part of it, and learn with others.
Erica?
Just coming back to the bit about community consultation, which is that when we put our planning application in for our 27 house development in a village where housing development, as Alan will know, is hugely controversial, we got 80 letters into the planning department of support for our development. So it's perfectly possible to get community support for what you're doing. It's just a matter of communication and keeping people on board. And yes, I mean, we had taken a bit of time over it, but don't have to. As long as you're really open and communicative and do listen to people, then you can actually win people over very, very quickly if what you're doing is real and actually meeting genuine local need and concern.
Charles, yeah.
Thank you. If I can just add to that, and picking up on the communications and the positive PR, there's something, I think you've probably heard the term of the David Attenborough effect before, but if you look at the effect that he and the BBC have had on single-use plastic usage, I know, for example, our company, Arcadis, they've said today that they've managed to cut out of most of their offices in the UK all single-use plastics. That's only happened as a result of positive public media attention, and I think that actually Devon and other local authorities in the area could take an action away to get behind the zero carbon agenda and publicise it in a more positive way than is happening currently. And my worry is that by focusing on the planning process and focusing on new build, we're looking at a very small section of the buildings in this county. We're probably looking at 3% per year. The other 97%, somehow people need to be convinced to change those dwellings, those commercial buildings, and actually a lot can be done with positive PR.
Interesting point, but also I think I'll pick up a point on which Dan made, which is that 2-3% per year. If we just make it like the last lot, we've lost a huge opportunity to change the nature of what the place would be like. Place shaping in my mind, it was almost about the next thing we build has got to be quite exceptional to make a difference, rather than it's just a derivative of what we've already done. And this has been a very useful and quite inspiring conversation for me, because what I take away from it, if I might just do a summary, is that as the climate emergency, one response is to create new stories about where we're going with communities and places, which are we're going to go somewhere which is better and more imaginative and gets more out of new development than we've done in the past. And that needn't mean a kind of a story about reduction. It's about doing something different. And if Rob Hopkins was here, he'd be saying it's about re-engaging imagination in terms of a positive response to this stuff. Yes, we do in the planning system have these kind of grinding gears that work slowly, but I'm struck that through the development of those stories, we might go a bit faster. And part of the speed of that would be, as Erica just said very well, is the community is more likely to engage positively with those stories than the monotony or the kind of the expected pitched battles of the planning system around just housing. Right. I think unless, Dan's got one more point, and then we're going to move on to the summary stuff.
I'll just keep this really quick. Planning is also a really good opportunity to pick up the things that aren't necessarily captured elsewhere, and I know embodied carbon was mentioned earlier. We haven't spoken about it since, but that obviously applies to new development. It's not captured, and planning is a sphere where we could start to capture that.
Okay, for those who are mindful of time, we will finish absolutely without fail by 4:30. I know there's a number who need to run, and if you've got to go before then, Erica, please, and thank you very much for your contribution. Just three issues for me to slightly change the topic areas, but to stimulate again some debate. The 3 points largely build on what Alan was starting to talk about, integration. The first of those is local supply chain development, the issue of understanding that, how we can actually influence a positive outcome through a lot of the interventions that we've just talked about, and develop those in the context of local supply chain development. The benefit of that is huge. If you look at best practice, then the concept, which you'll be familiar with, is now being termed a balanced scorecard approach. And if you see the benefits that can accrue from that, right across the sectors, construction is a really good example of that. And best practice around that, perhaps if we looked at Sherford, there was a requirement as part of the funding that was integrated into the Sherford model that there should be local sourcing of a number of those contracts. As a result of that, you'll see that the groundwork package was vested in a Cornwall and Devon-based groundworking contractor, and that hugely enriched that business and then enhanced their existing training and apprenticeship program. So there are some good examples of best practice, but it's a poorly understood area as to how the impact of integrated supply chain development works. It achieves a buyback, and the numbers are spectacular. If you look at, for every pound spent that is then recycled locally, the payback is about 2.5 times, as opposed to what traditionally happens. A national contractor come in, he outsources it, and that pound disappears somewhere else. So the concept around integrated supply chain development and a balanced scorecard approach, which achieves a huge number of other benefits. Green miles travelled is a good example of that, is something that we need to be considering. The second part is that we can't just consider the issues of building structures themselves. We need to think about the on-building solutions, the around-building solutions, and that introduces the whole subject of how we manage things like water recycling is perhaps a good example of that, how we use the urban landscape to enhance some of the natural enhancements we're looking for. So there's a clutch of issues in there, and I'm not sure that I'm convinced yet that they are rigorously applied or perhaps rigorously understood. And then perhaps most controversially, but again worthy of a discussion, is we could all institutionally achieve net zero carbon reductions by buying off the problem, i.e. biodiversity offsetting. How does that sit comfortably. We have an opportunity. I self-declare that I'm chair of the Biosphere Foundation, and we have the ability to pretty much absorb anyone else's carbon problems. We could plant 1 million trees in the next 2 years if we wanted to. 1,563 square miles of land is a lot of ground to play with, but the concept around do we accept the philosophy of somebody else's problem being paid off and inherited by another site. It's an interesting area to debate, but it's a debate we need to have.
I would agree with everything you said. We've got some good examples that have demonstrated a commitment. So Met Office, built by Wilmot Dixon, I think something like 80% of their procurement within 40 kilometres of the site. Real drilling down in their KPIs to local skills. Really pleasing to see that. That was a culture, company culture. We've seen with the work that Kia is doing on our leisure centre, the focus on the skills, the development of skills, the developed passive house, and now how that's being rolled out. And that again is a good example. I would say I don't think that's a consistent thing when we put when we go out with projects procurement-wise. I don't think we are as focused on making sure that that is delivered. It happens, but I don't think it's consistent. I think we could really get better at that across the public sector. So when we procure buildings and we go out to contract, we really focus on that element of the supply chain, development of supply chain, and getting the commitment to skills. We've had to do it because when we've built Passive House, and a lot of what we've done has been new, it's been a real struggle. And for the region as a whole, getting contractors interested in complex schemes, because we struggle at times to get people to bid for some of our environmental work because it's been a bit out of the ordinary. So I would agree with all that. What we've done in planning, so this is another planning issue for the local authorities. We used to say a lot about skills, but actually it wasn't a fundamental 106 type requirement. We created Greater Exeter building, followed Plymouth, learned from Plymouth, which is they've done constructing Plymouth. We followed the same, and now all of a sudden we've developed now within the schools a relationship to construction companies can get access to the school pupils now. In the past they couldn't. So I think we could do a lot more. I agree with you. The local food elements and land management issues, I think that's new, I think, for us. And I think it's where we need to go. I'm really interested in that. What I'm also interested in, what we've begun to do is things like healthy buildings. So we've now started to focus not just on the building itself in terms of environmental performance, but the kind of product that's in there, adhesives and how that works, as well as the landscaping that's around there. So there's been a learning from us, and I think that as part of the whole mix, I think that ought to be features of the way. And if we had a checklist of what you do, those elements would be in. And the final one was this sequestration. That's him.
But biodiversity offsetting, yeah.
And I think it's a major economic opportunity for us in places like North Devon with the biosphere and others. However, I don't think it's where we should be aiming as a first resort. I think for a lot of companies, they'll have no choice but to do that, and we should be making a major benefit of the fact that we have that opportunity in Devon, so it should be part of it. But first, I would suggest we should be directing to other things first, and if they can't, companies discharge that, we should then be majoring on that facility that we have.
Okay, Dan, I think was first, or next, sorry.
Just a quick point on the supply chains. I think in parallel to developing supply chains and skills, which is really important, we need to have a parallel pipeline of jobs for them to deploy the skills on, because we've had examples with feed-in tariff and renewable energy where we've had stop-starts and we've skilled people up and then there hasn't been the work available. I think you made the point actually about the passive house as well. And unless they have jobs in the locality to move on to, it's going to be a waste of resource. So feeding into what Ian was saying about energy sprung and maybe social housing and using those sorts of initiatives to kickstart the sector, they need to be done in parallel.
Just to touch on the point before we lose it around education, skills, apprenticeships generally, if I looked in Alan's direction, developing that pipeline, so Sherford has, as a direct result of the injection of money from the Homes and Community Agency, a skills centre, which is developing requisite skills, learning the inherited processes that are going on at Sherford. That builds on the old Pemicon programme, if you can remember back to those days in Plymouth, which is now evolved. But those interventions were hugely valuable. I think the question, because we need to think about timescales, is how long that conversion period takes. I mean, a couple of years to get a skilled somebody onto a construction site who understands sustainability techniques. Is that realistic, or is it longer than that, or do you have to start much earlier in the curriculum?
There's a whole range of different ways you can approach that. I mean, actually, in Brighton, I was involved in a project with Duncan Baker Brown called the Waste House. We built basically a house that sequestered more carbon than it used, and we brought in apprentices from the local technical college. The skills that they were learning, we're putting them ahead of the game. But we were kind of making up those skills as we went along. And, a lot of people think, when you're developing learning programs, that you have to have absolutely every answer mapped out for the curriculum to be worked out, whether it's, higher education, further education, training, internships, apprenticeships. Actually, project-based learning can mean that you are learning with your students, with your pupils, with your apprentices. So you can roll these programs out really successfully. I mean, if we were working with county councils, with high-volume builders even, we could develop a learning program live around that. That's not the problem. So in terms of developing your workforce and learning programs and pipelines, I think we should be doing that in tandem.
Okay, Andy.
Thank you. Just on your point around meeting kind of need locally, I suppose from my perspective, I grew up looking at Didcot Power Station during the 1980s and watching the stack, mixing, with the yellow fumes coming out, mixing with the vapour and gently wafting over and falling on Scandinavia as acid rain, which was a problem that was solved. But the lesson for me ultimately was that the grid sits there. It's not very visible in South West terms, but we have to take responsibility for how we generate electricity. And for me, what's happened at Cranbrook, for example, around decentralised energy is really important because people can just look down the road and they can own that to a greater degree. And I think that goes to, we should first and foremost be, accounting, if you like, for meeting our own carbon requirements and hitting the zero carbon that way. I do think, though, Devon, there's a big opportunity nationally that not every place is going to be able to do that. Things like the biosphere are nationally significant and are able to do that as an opportunity, an economic opportunity going forward. I know we looked at allowable solutions previously as a regime that could take, have a pipeline of decarbonising projects which had identifiable carbon savings within them, and those could almost be traded on a national stage if they were getting beyond the kind of net zero for Devon, if that makes sense. For me, that's the aspiration where we need to be. Skills, absolutely agree with you, and we've learned an awful lot, I think, from Sherford and Plymouth.
A comment, sorry. Yeah.
I think Andrew just said something quite important then about the grid and the fact that it's kind of an invisible bit of infrastructure, and that looking forward, if we're looking to move to electrification of the grid, of energy requirements and getting away from gas, is that how resilient is the national grid in the peninsula, and what is the forward-looking strategy for making sure that it can take increased renewables and increased demand from electric vehicles, from people getting rid of gas boilers, switching to gas to electric everything. So that's probably something that needs to be written down somewhere as a how does Devon and Cornwall deal with that situation, and is it robust at the moment? Will it be robust enough in 50 years' time? And how do we drive that on a national level?
Okay, there is another hearing on that issue, so we will certainly pick up that topic. So Ian's going to make a quick addition to this topic area, and then we need to move in a very disciplined way to a summing up, which is a chance for you to reflect on what we've said. So if, Ian, you want to lead us through this final section, chance to say what you haven't said already.
Ooh, okay. I was just going to make a final comment on this last thing rather than lead us through the next thing. But I think we've had a great success story in a different sector. So we're talking about the built environment here. In the electricity generation sector, we've had a fundamentally outstanding achievement in this country with offshore wind. Electricity costs £50 per megawatt hour to make the cheapest fossil fuel way. 7 years ago, it was £350 a megawatt hour to make by offshore wind farms. Today, it's £41 per megawatt hour to make it the offshore wind way. It's cheaper than the fossil fuel way, and this country is buying it in the gigawatts this year, next year, and for many years to come. And there are people working in this industry all around the country and in other countries that are doing this. How did it happen? It happened by leadership. The government said, we will buy offshore wind from you, the industry, at a really high £350 per megawatt hour price for a small number of units this year. Next year, we'll buy more units, but at a lower price, 300. The year after, we're going to buy more units of electricity still, but a lower unit cost, until we get down to £50 per megawatt hour. And it was that 7-year horizon of guaranteed buying and the step-by-step approach that brought in the industry to invest in the technology to deliver it. So that was government-led. Energy and electricity generation is a government-led sector. We're the built environment. We actually own the buildings, a lot of them. In terms of the 23 organisations that have signed up to climate emergency, 3 of them are social landlords with retained stock and have about, I guess, 15 to 20,000 homes. That's more than enough to build an industrialised sector delivering net zero energy retrofit of homes, using that energy strong approach and the business model that pays for itself. It's more than enough. We can do it on our own. We don't have to wait for permission from government or change planning rules or write a new local plan. We can do that on our own tomorrow and get the local jobs benefit. We also own a lot of public buildings, whether they be hospitals or libraries or schools or whatever, and we can begin to do the same with that. So I would say, let's look at what's worked elsewhere, apply those lessons, and do it with what we can do here, what we own, what we can drive ourselves.
Okay, so the final one minute, Erica, if you want to start so you can slip away as soon as you need to, that would be great. And if we just do it down the line, and then if we need to intervene, we will do so.
Really just to say thank you for the opportunity and how heartening it is to see what, if you'll excuse the expression, for me, there's sort of a load of suits from, big public organisations sitting around having really quite a radical conversation, and just how heartening it is. And thank you very much indeed. And really interesting for me, feeling that we've been at a very sort of extreme cutting edge for a while, and having conversations with ourselves. And actually, there were a lot more people out there we could have had the same conversation with. And yeah, that is just very heartening. And we need to keep on this, what is going to be a very steep trajectory. But I feel really quite encouraged. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to ditto that in that there's obviously a lot of enthusiasm and momentum here to drive change. It was just really to say that, domestic energy efficiency is probably one of the harder tasks to tackle and not quite as exciting as new build or sort of planning new developments. It's a bit more boring and a bit more laborious, I think, to improve our domestic dwellings, but it's obviously really key and not to be forgotten. But how it's done, I think we need to have conversations with the local housing authorities as part of this wider sort of strategy, and how they're enforcing things and what their resources are like to sort of drive change in the existing dwelling sector.
Well, great to meet so many people I'd like to now work with. In a relatively small way in Dartington, we are testing out various solutions, including, as Tim said, integrated supply chain development. We really want to model some of these solutions, but we certainly want to connect up to many people in the room and say, how can we work together? How can we learn together? I mean, back to what you were prompting me with there, Tim. Also, we are developing learning programs. So, we just developed a new BSc in Sustainable Food and Farming Enterprise. We can get programs on the books pretty quickly, which are about training, but really the programs we want to get on our books are about co-design, co-delivery of programs through, and when I talk about learning programs, I'm talking about project-based learning. So actually doing stuff together, working out what these solutions are, and at the same time developing learning programs that mean that these are sort of codified, published, disseminated, shared as models of meeting the challenges of our time.
Thanks. Yeah, it's definitely very heartening to see everyone on the same page, trying to think of some ideas and having a good strategic approach to delivering it across Devon. I think it's fantastic, and personally fully support it and do all I can to help. And from the RD&E's perspective as well, the organisation is really trying to get its head around how we can make some significant changes for the better in reduce our carbon emissions as rapidly as possible. So yeah, that's about all I've got to say, I suppose. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you again. We're in a climate emergency. I think it's really important that we recognise the role that central government has to play in terms of unlocking retrofit, in terms of setting minimum standards, or if they're not going to do that in a timely way, allowing us to set better standards locally. Like it or not, government, landlords, house builders are going to be part of the solution. They're part of the system. We need to be talking to them as well. So I realise we've not really included them today, but we have to start engaging with them. Otherwise, nothing will happen. But just on a very specific point, to pick up on what Kareem was saying earlier, on viability, I think this is definitely an area we can collectively work on, because this comes up every time in new developments, and I think we need to use the emergency to maybe reframe what's equitable in terms of land prices and house builder profits.
Yeah, ditto. I just noted the one thing for me, what was the viability thing. I think if there was a quick win, that would be the big one for me as well.
Sorry. I think we've always felt as architects that the environmental design sort of standards and accreditations has been a bit of a niche market, which we've only really applied if our client has been particularly that way inclined. But obviously this is serious. This is an emergency. The clue's in the name. So we really need to be using those skills more generally across all regions, all areas. And as you said, whether it's urban, rural, it applies to everything. So we can do this.
3 quick reflections from me. One, integration and proper planning being about securing multiple outcomes, including into areas like health and food supply, for example. Secondly, pace, and how do you disrupt standard operating procedures and associated timelines and actually deliver much more quickly. And thirdly, scale. Someone was explaining to me earlier that they were mentioning a desire previously to have a pan-Devon refuse contract, and there's obviously economies of scale there. It didn't prove possible, so what is stopping us getting to everyone who signed up to the climate change emergency saying, well, we're going to commission, X thousand energy strong homes retrofit over the next 5 years, for example? Because that, for me, feels eminently doable.
Just say sentiment. So we got a lot of technical expertise, we've got great examples, we know what to do. The pace at which we need to move for 2030 is such we need not gradual, there is some big calls, and it's going to cost. The difference is we are making a pitch that this is the region that will own the clean energy agenda. And therefore, it's the economic opportunities that come out of this, and the fact that we're prepared to do things that others aren't prepared to do to make it happen. So for me, it's about how do you recast this challenge into the economic opportunity that we all know it is. But we're going to have to do something, because it's not gradual, it's a step change in the kind of thing we're going to have to do.
Final evening, I suppose. Firstly, thank you for today. That's been really interesting. It's quite enjoyable talking big picture as well. I do think that, as I've mentioned before, the focus is around that business model, business case to attract the 97% of buildings that are currently using carbon in this county, and how we get them to change their business as usual. But also, it was touched on earlier, there is a skill shortage in the construction industry, and it's only getting worse. Sadly, we can't attract enough young people into our industry as we are. Leadership in this sector and showing plans for the future over a long time period will definitely help to address that and make it a more attractive industry to work in. So I couldn't recommend that more highly. And thanks again for today.
Okay, so from our perspective, the what next question, and just pick up the reflections on what we've picked up through this very dynamic discussion. I just the two words I was going to use, but Andy's used them already. Disruption is absolutely crucial if we're going to achieve some progresses. So that's the first word I would focus in on. Integration, absolutely crucial. The word that hasn't been used yet is communication. How do we develop a communication that is really powerful, potent and dynamic? And the fourth, and Alan alludes to this already, but it was on very firmly on my agenda, is that what we've achieved now as a group that needed to talk to each other, wants to talk to each other. So we have an ambassador group, and so the legacy that we will be looking at is to develop an ambassador group that's a reference point and that can start to open up a network for further dialogue. So that is my immediate reflections. Ian.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks to everybody. Yeah, I think we've all learnt a lot there. There's a lot of fine grain, anecdotal, coal-face sort of information and evidence that we've all got and that's been partly fed in today, and I'm sure there's a lot more to follow. The job of the guys behind us who are scribing is to turn this discussion into some notes and some actions that will, together with all the other hearings that are going on this week, next week and last week, will become information that is put before the Citizens' Assembly that is going to be constituted next year. And what follows next is the drafting of the Carbon Action Plan, or the Net Zero Action Plan for Devon. So that's going to move quite quickly next year. We can't sit back and wait for that plan. We need to be taking action now, and I think we've heard today in the built environment, we've got some oven-ready actions that we can be getting on with, and we've got some partnerships and some organisations that collectively have got capability to get on and do it. So let's get on and do it.
I think you should have come last, Ian. I can't follow that. I've just got two reflections. The first is that I think we've concluded that the nature of climate emergency means we need to broaden our understanding of what planning is, and that could be a really good thing. It's not extra burden. It's actually exercise in joining things up much more effectively around how we organise place, basically. The second is a detail point, which we kind of touched on most specifically around viability, which is, I think, best expressed by put some data on stuff and then share that data. And particularly around if it's a net zero target, what does specific actions contribute to net zero? Where do they get us to? Because that commitment to the overall target is very important, but I suspect we could get lost in sentiment around what a thing might do, rather than actually putting some data and then sharing that data and then using it to affect change. I guess as I'm on last, thank you all very much for the time you spent coming here and the effort and the thought. It's been a really useful session in my belief, and go well on your way home.